Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome commission members, advisors, staff, on-site visitors, and online listeners to the December 13th, 2018 meeting of the North Carolina Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission. This Standards Commission develops and recommends to the State Board of Education rules related to all aspects of educator preparation programs. I'm Michael Marr, Vice Chairman of the Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission, and I call this meeting to order. Our agenda and materials are available online through the DPI website, www.ncpublicschools.org, on the SBE meetings link. The meeting is also audio streamed through a link located at the bottom of the e-board agenda. I will now read the ethics statement that is required of us. Commission members are reminded that it is our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this commission. Does any member of the Commission know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. If during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the Chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. Dr. Seiberg will now call the roll.
Dr. Bullock is absent. Mr. Childers?
Here.
Thank you. Dr. Dempsey?
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Fleming?
Here.
Thank you. Ms. Janeski?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. McKinney?
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Graham? Okay. Ms. Hyatt? Dr. Houston is absent. Mrs. Jones?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Lockus? Okay. Dr. Locklear?
Here.
Thank you. I thought I heard you come in. Miss Loftus? Okay. Dr. Marr is here. Dr. McIntyre is here.
Here.
Thank you. Dr. Miller is absent. Dr. Weddington is here. And Dr. Wood.
Present.
We have a quorum. Commission members, you've had an opportunity to review the proposed agenda for today's meeting. Do I have a motion to approve this agenda for the December 13th, 2018 meeting?
So moved.
It's been properly moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
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 The minutes from our previous commission meeting on November 8th, 2018 have been prepared and made available to you. Do I have a motion to approve these minutes?
So moved.
Second.
Have it. Okay. It has been properly moved and seconded. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Thank you.
Aye.
I do want to make one note that we're going to have a slight reordering of the agenda. After we get through Dr. Tomberlin's updates, we're going to skip down. I'm sorry. We're going to hold on Mr. Snyder until the end of the meeting. Okay. So I now call on Dr. Tom Tomberlin and Dr. Kim Evans to provide the Board of Education updates.
Good morning. I wanted everyone to know that TCED 009 passed unanimously at the State Board of Education in December. And then also I have one announcement. There's a save the date that I sent everyone earlier that's about North Carolina accreditation community sessions in January. On the 10th, it will be hosted by our very own Teresa Coogan in Educator Prep. And she wanted everyone to know that this is a free session, and it's all about CAPE information, and there's 3 different sessions. You can register for 1 session or 2 sessions or all 3 sessions. I will make sure to send out the save the date again for any Pepsi members or any EPP folks that would like to register for that. And registration is open until January 1st, 2019. Are there any questions?
Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Tomberlin?
Good morning.
Good morning.
At the December board meeting, I presented to the State Board of Education on the issue of chronic teacher absenteeism. And though this is not a licensure or preparation policy, I do think it is it would be of interest to the commission to hear what the result of this study was and how the board is considering moving forward. I would like to make this fairly brief, so I'm just going to cover the highlights. Of course, if you have a copy of.
Did anybody else hear that screeching noise?
Yes.
Okay.
A little bit, yes.
That usually means that somebody has their connected to their computer and to their phone.
All right, I think we're clear.
I think we figured it out.
All right, great. So I want to just go over some of the highlights. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. And you can read it at your leisure, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the findings or the methodologies. On page 11, on slide 11, we provide the general statistics on how many teachers fall into this category of chronically absent. And to be clear about how we counted these folks, these are folks who take 10 or more absences over the course of the school year, but not more than 5 in a single month. And the reason we excluded those is we figured if those absences are collected within or concentrated in one pay period, that's probably a significant illness the teacher's experiencing. So we were looking for teachers who had sporadic absences across the year, but totaled 10 or more. And as you can see, about 20% of our educators are chronically absent every year under our definition. On slide 18, we look at the number of the. I think my numbers are off. There we go. On this slide, you can see that we look at how the rate of recidivism, I guess, in chronic absenteeism. What percentage of our teachers are experiencing chronic absenteeism over consecutive years? And in the chart on the left, you can see about 5,000 teachers in this sample. We looked over 3 years. About 5,000 or 7% of our teaching population experienced chronic absenteeism every year they were in the study. And then about 12% experienced it in the two of the 3 years. And the chart on the right is those teachers that we only had information on for 2 years. So you can see that this is not an insignificant population of teachers. So aside from the descriptive statistics, we looked at a couple of, we analyzed the data in a couple ways to look at the impact of chronic absenteeism on student growth. And we did this a couple of ways. We looked within school. So teachers within a school, how do they differ from their peers if they are chronically absent? And what we found there is those teachers who are chronically absent experience about 0.3 of an index point lower value-added score than their non-chronically absent peers. This is statistically significant, but we would argue it's not practically significant in that that's well within the normal variation in value added from one year to another within a teacher. Next, we look at the teachers themselves and whether they, compared to other years in which they were not chronically absent, what was the effect of chronic absenteeism on their student growth. And again, the finding is negative, small significantly, but not practically significant. And then we looked across schools and then in relation to teacher working conditions. And we did not, again, we found with across schools, small negative, statistically significant. Teacher working conditions did not seem to have any relationship, statistically significant relationship with teacher absenteeism. We also looked at the differential impact of being chronically absent on the school's financial situation. And if you'll move to, I can't see which slide number it is. There we go. So teachers who are chronically absent, as you can see there, miss on average 13 school days per year. A teacher that we don't consider chronically absent on average misses 5, around 5.5. And so that difference of 7.62, or roughly 7.5 to 8 days, what is the cost to the state in terms of extra funding that is needed to cover those absences? And you can see on the far right, it runs about $17 million annually. So chronically absent teachers cost the state an additional $17 million a year in substitute teachers than non-chronically absent teachers. So the question becomes, how can we develop a policy that respects the fact that teachers have a very difficult job and they need time off, and certainly they need sick leave, but trying to address this high rate of absenteeism among our faculty? So one thing we looked at were the policies related to sick leave. And one of the things we found was that there is a policy for extended sick leave. And extended sick leave in some districts, well, let's first look at the policy and how it's worded here. If you could see the piece in the word available in red there, extended sick leave is available to teachers once they have exhausted all available accumulated paid leave. So this is 20 additional sick days that a teacher can tap into. The question that we have from the field is, what does available mean? Does it mean available on the day that I need to take the absence? And if that's the case, then, and if it's an instructional day, the teacher is prevented or precluded from using annual leave or bonus leave on those days. And so some districts interpret this to mean if it's an instructional day and they're out of sick leave, they can tap into these 20 sick days. Other districts say available means it is on the books for you and you have to use that before the 20, you can access those 20 days. So in addition to that policy, there's another policy for catastrophic illness, where the superintendent at his or her discretion can allow a teacher to use annual leave on an instructional school day if the local superintendent deems that the reason is, and there's a host of reasons listed at the bottom there in 3.22, the debilitative nature of the condition, the life-threatening potential, duration, monetary hardship, expected length, other options available to the employee. And so the superintendent has very broad discretion in how he or she can allow a teacher to use other forms of leave on an instructional day. What we're proposing to the State Board of Education is that we clarify the order of operations of these policies. We would argue that once the sick leave is exhausted, once a teacher's 10 sick days are exhausted in a year, that then they would need to apply for catastrophic illness and use any of their available leave before tapping into the additional sick days. And so that's the discussion that was had and with State Board of Education, and we will be bringing a policy forward to clarify that, how those those policies interact with one another. But we wanted to make sure that the commission was aware of these recommendations, and if you have input onto those, this is not a formal policy that I think falls under the commission's purview, but we certainly want to solicit your feedback and your thoughts on what we're proposing to the board.
Hey, Tom, this is Glenda. Could this proposal go to the task force where we've got more HR administrators and superintendents sitting on it?
Yes, ma'am. We need to do that. I was out yesterday. I was out of town yesterday for our task force meeting, and I apologize for that. But yes, we will need to bring that to the teacher recruitment and retention task force. We may do that.
I do think that we need some clarification there, but it would be just very helpful if we could get the inputs from, other districts in the state where we're actually having to implement this.
Absolutely. We will bring this back to the January recruitment and retention task force.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions for Dr. Tomberlin? Okay. Thank you, Dr. Tomberlin and Dr. Evans. Next, we'll move to LICN 001, the Licensure Subcommittee recommendations. Dr. Tomberlin is going to introduce policy changes for LICN 001 as recommended by the Pepsi Licensure Subcommittee for discussion.
Great. The LICN 001, we would like to bring it, this policy back to the State Board of Education for discussion and approval with the recommended changes from the Commission. And I just want to briefly review those recommended changes with the Commission. On page 2 of the policy, we insert a link so that folks in using LICN 001 can quickly link to the licensure requirements for the various teaching areas that we license. It's not really a substantive change, but a change that nonetheless that we need to bring before you. On page 6 of the policy, going back to the term proficient, what we have struck the language that changes the definition of proficient on June 30th, 2019. That was originally proposed to take effect on June 30th, 2019. We will go back to the original definition of proficient. That is, a teacher has to meet 3 of the 5, has to be proficient on 3 of the 5 evaluation standards, with standard 4 being one of those. Or if the teacher's on an abbreviated plan, standard 4 at least has to be proficient in order to be considered proficient for a variety of different opportunities. This policy actually, this definition actually extends into some other policies, TCED 6016 with the beginning teacher support process. What we're proposing is that we bring this definition with the understanding that everywhere else where proficient is referenced in state policy, we will use this definition, we will apply this definition when and if the board approves it.
Okay, so that would include cooperating teachers for student teachers.
That is correct. The heart of these changes comes on page 8, and I want to be clear about how we constructed this. So we have a section 1.21 that deals with North Carolina licenses for out-of-state teachers. Because we are proposing changes that will take effect June 30th, 2019, we feel like we need to keep the one section that's got the rules for right now, and then we added another section that that delineates the rules moving forward July 1st, 2019. And so for out-of-state educators in 21A, we simply state that this section remains valid until June 30th, 2019. And then in 1.21B, we set the effective date for 7/1/2019. And within that, we addressed the issue of comparability of test scores from other states. And on page 11 of the policy, in section 3, we see educators with 3 or more years of experience. We've struck the first two, A and B, which requires the test to be comparable. And we state that the out-of-state applicant must take a licensure exam which partially meets the requirements for licensure in that state at the time the test was taken. So whatever state you were certified in or licensed in, whatever licensure exam was required for, or at least met the partial requirements for that license, you have to have that test and show and demonstrate a passing score. And that score needs to be the passing score at the time the exam was taken. And so this allows us to strike this comparability language. And in essence, we would take a valid license from any other state in the country as long as they have a licensure exam. Now, I do want to point out that teachers from Wisconsin who have been recently licensed, since Wisconsin has dropped all of their licensure exams, those teachers would be required under this policy to take our licensure exam. And any other state that elects not to have a licensure exam. So we'll take any other exam, but there has to be an exam, and the teacher has to demonstrate a passing score. Most of the other changes to this are just clarifying the fact that the exam has to meet the licensing standards of the state at the time that the exam was taken. And then we address educators with fewer than 3 years of experience. And at the recommendation of the subcommittee, we have removed the requirement that teachers with less than 3 years of experience have to take the North Carolina exam. They can, if they can demonstrate a passing score from another state, then we will accept that score. For elementary, however, we're legally obligated to require a subtest of mathematics and reading. We cannot have just a general single score. We have to have those sub-scores, and those have to be passing scores. I'll take a minute to pause there and see if there's any questions or concerns.
So I do have a
So is that Tom talking? Tom, is that you?
It's Michael now, but it was
Or is
Tom.
that Andrew?
No, it's
Who
Michael.
was just talking, Tom or Andrew?
Tom.
Tom, this is Glenda. I just wanted to clarify on what you just said about elementary. So those elementary folks that do not have the reading and math subtests from out of state, we are going to allow them to enroll in DPI's Reading and Mathematics Foundations course or take the test, right?
That is correct.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
So my question is there the possibility that in a future date, perhaps a year from now, that we're able to look at the number of teachers who've been licensed from other states and the tests that they are in fact taking? I'd like to get a sense of the number of teachers who are coming here from other states and the kinds of tests that those teachers are taking. My concern is that we could end up with this kind of race to the bottom mentality where individuals are seeking out the easiest possible state to get licensed, right? Pass those tests, and then come in through that this kind of backdoor method.
I think that's.
I think that sounds sorry. I was going to say I think that sounds a lot like what Andrew parroted yesterday at the task force meeting. Was your concern, Michael? But you know, one of the things that we've done in North Carolina is we've made it under law infinitely easier for districts to terminate teachers that are not performing during their first 3 years of employment. That's part of legislation, so that's much easier. We've also worked with our principals so that they know how to evaluate folks once we get them employed in the buildings. And, you know, we've actually looked at the research, and there's not any correlation out there between the licensure exam and the effectiveness of the teacher. You know, the staff development that we provide locally in districts, that's one of the best things that we do to grow our teachers into effective teachers. I would also say that our EPPs in state are doing a good job and will continue to do a great job, I think, of weeding out any poor performers during the preparation process. And just because they finish a program in North Carolina or somewhere else and they're not successful on a test that bars them from licensure or bars them from becoming a teacher in the classroom, you know, I think that's the challenge we have, because right now charter schools, restart schools, independent school districts can all hire teachers who don't have a license in anything to teach. So I think there are so many intricately woven policies out there that are right now preventing us as LEAs from filling critical vacancies that, you know, we're on the right track here. I think for the first time in a very, very long time, and you will hear that from across the states, from HR administrators, from principals, you will hear that from superintendents in the state, where they will tell you that we need true reciprocity and we've got to remove barriers. What I think will be interesting is to look at Wisconsin and see later, because they dropped the testing, they dropped that barrier, to just see how they're performing or see how they're recruiting more teachers to their state.
So I'm not going to disagree with anything you've said. I agree with you, Glenda. My only concern, you know, will come up later, even when we discuss this kind of draft bill that's being looked at now on the educator preparation dashboard, and that, you know, we're essentially holding teacher prep programs to one standard, and we're not holding everybody to that same standard. And yet the argument around teacher performance always seems to kick back to teacher preparation programs in North Carolina. So I just want to make sure that there's some accountability on the other end, and that we're in fact just looking at data as it becomes available. So
I think
I agree with you, Michael. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, Glenda. This is Joe, and from a principal perspective, I think Glenda absolutely hit the nail on the head. You know, with the shortage, particularly that so many of our at-risk schools are facing, sometimes it simply comes down to whether or not you're going to have a teacher in the room, and I think Glenda's points are very well made.
Michael, this is Van. I think I'm repeating maybe what Michael said. My concern about this is, if you take UNC Wilmington, we might decide not to endorse a candidate for certification on the basis of a standard we have in North Carolina. That student graduates, goes to another state. That state is willing to give them a certificate. They teach in that state for 3 years. They can then come back into North Carolina and ultimately be fully certified. So my issue is not, I mean, I do have an issue of reciprocity means we've all agreed to a common standard. And if you meet that standard, you can move across state lines, which is different from we basically have an open transfer process. As long as the higher education institutions can have that same kind of flexibility, then that levels the playing field, and it gives principals and personnel offices greater flexibility in hiring. But I think Michael has raised an important point that a person can, an institution or an EPP, not recommend them for certification. They go to another state, need a lower bar, and then they can transfer that back in. That's not reciprocity. Reciprocity is we all meet the same standard of practice.
good.
So just to clarify on that particular issue, the teacher would not need.
Go ahead.
The teacher would not need to teach for 3 years in another state. Under this policy, the teacher could immediately, could take another could complete at UNC Wilmington, take, I'm just going to use Guam because I don't think we have any teachers from Guam, could take Guam's licensure exam and apply for licensure in North I think how we measure the effectiveness of EPPs is secondary to getting teachers in classrooms, but I think this particular policy consideration does have impact on how we measure the performance of EPPs. This is going to make that more challenging, and we need to think through how that is going to be accomplished.
Okay.
Also, I think teacher recruitment, the State of the Teaching Profession report can help us shed a lot of light on this issue that Mrs. Jones was referencing earlier, with districts having more flexibility in dismissal. We do gather that information every year to see what those rates are, and those rates, from what I've seen, have not changed over time with this additional flexibility to dismiss. So I think we need to think about that. And I think it's also important to consider the fact that North Carolina prepared teachers on average are more effective than out-of-state teachers or lateral entry teachers, and their 5-year retention rate or attrition rate is half that of lateral entry or out-of-state prepared teachers. So these are all considerations that need to be, that come into how we create this policy, and what we do, what we ultimately recommend moving forward.
So Tom, this is Linda again, and I don't disagree with some of your points without looking at the data. But what I can tell you is, and we agree, EPPs have to have a way to measure. But the bottom line is, we are not producing enough teachers in the state of North Carolina. The bottom line is, I can go to my teachers. Charter schools can hire folks with no license. They don't have to go through an approved program. They don't have to align with the residency program. Our Restart schools, we can follow the same flexibility that charter schools are allowed. We can do the same thing in these entire independent school districts that we have, like Rowan County right now, where they have the complete charter-like flexibility. And no one can show me that those folks who are just living, breathing bodies with a degree walking into a classroom to teach, that their data is any better than a teacher that I've hired from out of state somewhere to come in. And we need teachers. That's the bottom line.
There really is some data about that Kevin Bastian has collected. I think that those coming from out of state, according to his data, and some of you help me out if I'm getting this wrong, are our worst performers. Am I wrong about that? Maybe I need to check those studies, but Kevin Bastian's been doing studies of this, of the impact on student achievement of teachers prepared in multiple pathways, and out of state is one category, and I think that they're always the lowest. Am I wrong about that?
So I'm going to let Dr. Bastian present to the commission, and I'll let him present those findings. I would prefer just to speak about it generally and let him put the numbers behind the data.
Yeah, sure. He's not here right now, is he?
He is, in fact.
Kevin. He'd probably say a sentence,
if we planned it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I have one more little piece of this policy that I need to review with you, and that's on page 14. In terms of adding teaching areas to existing teacher licenses, we've had a couple of pathways in place for quite a while. I think that most people are familiar with. We have, however, on the advice of the subcommittee, added a fifth possibility, and that's 2 years of relevant work experience in the past 5 years. So if the teacher has taught, I assume this is in a private school or some other educational setting where they taught that particular content area for 2 years, then a teacher who's licensed in another area could be granted a license if that's demonstrated. There was one piece to this that I added because of the way we do provisional licensing. If it would be possible for a teacher to teach 2 years on a provisional license and use that 2 years to get the other license cleared without taking any coursework or any tests. And so I myself, not at the request of the subcommittee, put in this provision that a provisional license could not be used for this because that would just be a loophole to getting the license without any preparation. That can be, we can certainly take that out if the commission wants that removed, but I just wanted to explain why that particular piece was there.
Does relevant work experience only relate to K-12 teaching? I'm a little worried that that could be a little bit vague, right? Like, so for example, if you have an individual who's teaching and then in the evening teaching math at a community college, could they use community college teaching experience, or could they use higher education teaching experience, right? Or are we talking about exclusively K-12 experience? I just think we need to spell that out if that's in fact the case.
Sure.
Doesn't that provisional license there help with that as a qualifier? Because it would have a provisional license to be for LEAs in order to be gaining that experience.
I'm a little confused.
Does that clarify that for you, Michael?
No, I think I'm still confused by the two.
So, Ms. Jones, I want to clarify that the work experience accrued while working under a provisional license cannot be used to clear the license. So in Dr. Marr's example, I'm teaching social studies in a high school, but I teach math for the community college at night. Can I use the math experience in the community college setting to qualify for an add-on licensure in mathematics?
Nice.
So if the person, I understand what he's asking there, so that may require some different clarification, but the 2 years of relevant work experience in the past 5 years, if that teacher has been on a provisional license working in that area, why would we put that as a qualifier that would not count? How else would they gain that experience if they're not licensed in the area?
So my understanding was this was work outside of the traditional K-12 system, and what I was trying to, what I was identifying earlier was this just creates a loophole that if you put a teacher, if you provisionally license your PE teacher to be your physics teacher for 2 years, then that teacher could have a clear physics license without taking any physics courses or
the
taking
exam.
an exam, just by virtue of the fact that the LEA decided to employ them in that role. And the provisional license has its own set of requirements as listed in 150
Right.
that would need to be modified if we were going to use that as a vehicle for clearing the license.
So I guess my question is, could you just add either add 2 years of relevant K-12 work experience, or do we really just want to say 2 years of relevant? Because who's going to determine the relevant work experience?
My assumption would be that the licensure staff would determine the relevance. And I think we're back to the original problem that we had with comparable in the licensure exam. Who's making that determination? And licensure folks, I think this needs to be defined more clearly if what we consider
So Tom,
to be relevant.
an example would be if I hired a teacher to work in one of my restart schools that doesn't have to have a license right now, and under the law, I can do that.
Sure.
And they teach science for 3 years in that restart school without a license because they can legally do that. So now, under the way you've worded that, would we be able to get that person a license in the state of North Carolina to teach science or whatever?
No, because they didn't have a license to add on
Because that's
to.
what the problem's going to be. We're going to run into that. The more restart schools and independent school districts we get, the more difficult it's going to be to even during the transfer process. So let's say allotments get cut at a particular building, And typically, we look at the licensure areas to see if we can move those teachers somewhere else. Well, if they've never gotten a license, but they've been teaching for the past 4 years or 5 years in that school, that's the only school that I can employ them in. So now, am I displacing somebody that's a veteran teacher that has a license in that area and moving them over to a school that requires a license if I can't use that provision? And I think that was part of the issue was there are people that maybe do not have a degree in that area, but that's something that is an expert, they're an expert in. It could be they're teaching community college at night and they've been teaching it for 5 years, back to Michael's point, or an adjunct professor for science, but they only teach math, or they only teach social studies, or they only teach PE. I think that's what we were trying to get at with that verbiage.
Oh, that helps clarify, and so my response to that would be, I think this is the wrong place to try to achieve that goal, because you're talking about an actual path to licensure. This, in your scenario, so under this provision, the teacher would already hold a clear license in some other subject. And so if you had to transfer that teacher from a restart school to a different school, you would have to put them in the license area for which they hold the clear license. So your larger issue remains relevant in that a teacher that you bring on in your district into restart school, they are free from the requirements of licensure. That is correct. But you're recognizing an issue that I'm dealing a lot with LEAs is what happens to that teacher moving forward? Are they confined to those districts? And the flexibility extend, as long as you remain outside of the licensure system, that flexibility exists. But once you enter a teacher into the licensure process, then the flexibility is no longer exists. They have to conform to the state board policies related to licensure. So if we need to change, if that's what we want to change and address, that would have to be done in a different part of the policy, I think.
So I don't think that's all, Tom. That's one example. This originally, I think, originated with the fact that we've had to collapse a number of positions in our districts across the state because we don't have enough teachers. And we are collapsing them, and we're asking other teachers that are certified in those areas to take on those, either buy back, if it's a secondary position, we're buying back their planning periods and asking them to stay that extended amount of time after the school day to make that up, and then to take on an extra class of students because we don't have a science teacher. But I might be able to go find somebody in my building as a principal that I know that maybe they, they work with some club after school, or they do something as an adjunct professor or some other area that where I know they've got an expertise. Maybe they were a teacher assistant for a number of years in a particular area, and they've just got, that's something that they are an area of strength for them. Well, now, if I want to add an area, yep, I can add a provisional license to it. But if they have had years of experience, however they got the experience working in that area, that just continues to create an issue for us. And I thought what we were really trying to do with this policy is to give more flexibilities for school districts in order to fill those vacancies. And, if I can hire a lateral entry teacher and no offense to lateral entry, because we have some great lateral entry teachers, but if I can hire them and bring them in to teach the same thing, and they don't even have any pedagogy whatsoever, they don't have any traditional experience, but they're considered qualified. I'm getting feedback now, I'm not sure why, but if they're considered qualified to teach and these other folks are not, that's a problem for school districts.
I don't disagree. I think all I'm trying to communicate is we need to find. I think what you're talking about is a separate licensure path, and I think this piece could stay in the provisional section. We could certainly talk about that, and I will leave it to the commission to think about the idea of provisionally licensing someone and then not following through with that provisional licensing requirement and just granting them the clear license after 2 years. That's the issue for what's in 122. However, if we want to build this separate path to licensure based on employment and potentially demonstrated mastery, that would require a different licensure path somewhere else in the policy.
This is
and this is Freeberg speaking. I just wanted to say I think part of the difficulty here is that we have such a dearth right now, and I think Glenda's feeling that, and the principal that was speaking that, and I think that there needs to be some way that we can get somebody hired and then work through the process. I don't know if that means a separate commission that does this, but allows the district to hire someone and then work through this so that we can have that teacher in the classroom. And I think that's part of the fear here is that we really need teachers in our buildings and in our classrooms. And so I'm not sure the best process right now, but I feel that being needed.
Okay, so I feel like we're talking about two different things from kind of an outsider's perspective, right? As I absolutely agree with everything that's been said. I would echo the challenges we have in the state with the teacher shortage. We have certainly shortages in teacher preparation enrollment. This is a huge issue in our state. But it seems to me that when we look at this particular policy, 1.22 is really about adding a license to an existing license. It's not about bringing people in per se. It's about those individuals who already hold a license. And so the only question I had when I brought this up initially was about the areas of this idea of relevant work experience. So this is if you have a teacher who's already employed and they're a licensed teacher and you want to move them from one area to another, they teach in that area for 2 years, they're able to add that area without any additional barriers. That's my understanding, right? However, if you have a lateral entry teacher, that teacher cannot use 2 years of teaching experience to be granted a license. This is about adding a license to an existing one, not granting a new one. And so what really this policy, the way I see it, is it just doesn't create a loophole for individuals to come in, teach for 2 years, and then be exempt from any licensing or coursework requirements. Is that correct, Dr. Tomberlin?
That was the purpose of adding the second sentence. Correct. Was to prevent that.
This is Glenda again, and I would say if we go back and look to House, when we did No Child Left Behind, we did something very similar by looking to see what teachers had experience teaching, and then we were able to add those areas. Now, I understand No Child Left Behind is gone, but during that time frame, we went back and we looked at, and they were able to go through a process called House so that we could get them certified to teach because of the highly qualified requirements. And these were teachers who had experience teaching, and a lot of times it was our special ed teachers who needed to be certified in all the different areas, and they had spent years teaching math, science, social studies, and language arts. And then we were able to add that to their license because of the experience that they had. And I think that was the entire goal here with this provision, was for us to be able to fill vacancies internally with existing staff and add an area to their license without adding all this additional work on top of that and testing on top of that. Because if they're not effective doing it, we're going to deal with that at the LEA level.
Right, Glenda, I think you and I, you and I are on the same side of this issue. We're not arguing cross purposes, I guess, right? We're on the same side. I'm not asking for additional work or additional testing. I was just merely clarifying that the individuals already hold a clear license, that it's not laterals. And I just wanted us to clarify the 2 years of relevant work experience and whether or not that pertains to K-12 teaching experience or other kinds of experience? And if it's other kinds of experience, then who would make the determination of whether or not that work experience was relevant?
So could that be K-12 and university level experience? Because I would argue that a university teacher, whether they're adjunct or full-time teaching math.
Sure, and I would be good with that.
K-12
K-12 or post-secondary teaching experience within the discipline.
Absolutely.
So if I might propose that we rework this particular provision. We're not in a tremendous rush here. These things won't go into effect until July 1, 2019 with the 1920 licensing season. And if the commission would like to decide whether the other provisions that essentially grant reciprocity on testing, if the commission would like to move that forward, we could bring that to the State Board of Education as a separate piece and rework this work experience provision.
Okay, so the recommendation would be to move forward the Go ahead.
Just out of curiosity, about what's the number on average of instances where this takes place, where we would need, like, how many of these do we have on a yearly basis?
I think that's difficult to answer because it seems to be more and more this year where we have collapsed. I mean, I can count off the top of my head right now 6 positions, and I'm sure I have more that I've had to collapse. And we've had to seek people within the buildings to be able to buy back their planning experience. And that's just Cabarrus County. All across the state,
potentially this could be 500 or 600 across the state?
Oh, I have no idea. I have no idea.
Okay. So the recommendation is to move forward with changes, policy changes for LICN 001 with the exception of the changes to section 1.22. Is that correct, Dr. Tomlin?
I make that motion.
Second, Wesley Wood.
Okay,
Second.
So it's been properly moved and seconded. Any further discussion?
Michael,
Van?
I'm not aware of a single EPC that wants to limit the number to repair.
Dr. Dempsey, you're cutting out. We missed the first part of what you said.
So I don't want the message from the previous conversation to be that there are EPPs that are attempting to limit or restrict, excuse me, the number of teachers provided to North Carolina. If some of the flexibility that we're talking about through other routes into the profession are given to the EPPs, we can prepare more teachers, but we don't have that flexibility because we have to meet a higher standard. If we were given greater autonomy to determine on behalf of the state, we believe a person is qualified to teach in spite of performance on a particular indicator. I guarantee you we're going to put more teachers out into the profession and then let principals and personnel officers and superintendents decide should they stay in the profession. But back to one of the points Glenda raised earlier, not only am I not interested in limiting the number, I want to grow the number, but I need the autonomy to help do it.
Thank you, I agree.
Dr. Dempsey, to your point, I think that's something that the commission ought to be able to take up in a separate policy, something that we could work on to give more flexibility to our EPPs, because I certainly agree with you, and I don't think you'll find anybody at the LEA level that will disagree with that, from superintendents on down. But I do think that's something that we need to work on separately from us being able to staff our buildings right now.
Okay, thank you. Any further discussion? Okay, hearing none, I call for a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstain?
I'll abstain, yeah.
Dr. Weddington will abstain. Thank you, Dr. Tomberlin. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Kevin Bastian, Senior Research Associate and Associate Director for the Education Policy Initiative at Carolina, to present data on the Pearson licensure exams. His presentation is part of the data requested during the November Pepsi meeting for the recommendation for the math content exam.
Thank you, Dr. Marr.
Thank you.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'll assume silence is also a yes. All right, so thank you very much to the Commission and to Dr. Tomberlin, et cetera, for the opportunity to present today. I'm going to talk about the Pearson licensure exams and the extent to which they predict the performance of early career teachers. This is work we've done at EPIC with Christina Patterson, who's actually now at Georgia Southern. And I certainly want to acknowledge the UNC system for their support and funding of this work. So they make a lot of the research we're able to do in North Carolina possible. I want to give just a little bit of background today on the suite of 3 Pearson licensure exams, and then mostly discuss the analyses we've performed. And to do that, talk a little bit about our sample and what outcome measures we're looking at for teachers, how we've taken Pearson licensure exam scores and turned them into measures for analyses, give a little bit of descriptive data on those who pass versus do not pass the exams on their first attempt, and then talk about our results for EVOS and evaluation ratings. So just as a little bit of background, although I don't think this group would need much, there's a suite of 3 Pearson licensure exams for elementary and exceptional children general curriculum licensure areas. The first, Foundations of Reading, assesses knowledge of reading development, comprehension, instruction, and assessment. And conceptually, a teacher's performance on this exam should be related to their students' achievement in either early grades reading, which we can assess with the M class, or upper elementary grades reading through the reading EOG, for instance. The second of 3 exams is the general curriculum multi-subject. And this assesses knowledge of language arts, history and social sciences, and science and technology. And of course, what that sort of means is roughly only a third of the test is each of those parts. So it's a little hard to look at candidates or beginning teachers' performance on this assessment and EVOS estimates in a particular subject area, for instance, because there's a lot of different parts in that exam, right? The final of the 3 Pearson licensure exams is the mathematics assessment. It's assessing knowledge of numbers and operations, functions in algebra, geometry and measurement, and statistics and probability. Here again, conceptually, we should be able to look at its relationship with teachers' value-added or EVOS estimates in upper elementary grades on the mathematics EOG. So a few details about our sample and what outcomes we're looking at. So we're going to look, our research sample is 1,121 teachers, so individuals paid as teachers in the state's public schools who have less than 3 years of experience in the 14-15 through 16-17 school years, and they have scores on all 3 of the Pearson licensure exams. So that's our sample. We're going to look at 2 different outcome measures: EVOS estimates from the state's early grades reading, so the M-class reading 3D, and then EOG exams in grades 3 through 6. So that would be reading in grades 3 through 6, math for grades 4 and 5, 4 through 6, and science in grade 5. And we'll also look at evaluation ratings on each of the 5 professional teaching standards. And we standardize both the EVOS estimates and the evaluation ratings so that we can interpret the relationship between teachers' performance on the licensure exams and these measures as sort of a standard deviation in what you might call teacher effectiveness or teacher performance. We perform 2 basic models, more or less: screening and signaling. So a screening model is going to assess, in our case, we're going to make a screening model assess whether those who passed a particular licensure exam on the first try whether they're more effective than a peer who did not. So for example, we might assess whether those who pass foundations of reading on the first attempt have higher EVOS estimates from the M class than a peer who did not pass foundations of reading on the first try. Our signaling models don't really look at whether someone's passed or not. They're just asking the question of whether those with higher licensure exam scores are more effective than those with lower scores. So again, to give an example, we might be asking whether those who score a standard of a deviation higher on the mathematics licensure exam, do they have higher value-added estimates in upper elementary grades mathematics? And in all of these analyses, we're going to control for characteristics of the teacher, the students they're teaching using the roster data and student demographic information, and characteristics of the schools they're working at to better isolate those relationships between exam performance and teacher outcomes. So this next slide is a descriptive slide for the, and I want to be clear, for the 1,121 teachers in our, early career teachers in our sample, is a descriptive slide showing some basic teacher characteristics in the top panel and school characteristics in the bottom panel, or middle panel, I guess technically, of people who passed each of the respective assessments on their first attempt and those who did not. To be clear, this isn't sort of a larger pass rate. This isn't a cohort pass rate. You know, this is very generalized to this particular sample. You can see at the bottom the first-time pass rates on each of these three respective exams for this sample, that 1,121 teachers. So about 77% for foundations of reading, 79% for the multi-subject exam, and about 2/3, 66% for mathematics. So what's important from my perspective in this table, or what stands out? I think three things. First, if you look at the top when it comes to teacher demographics, minority teachers make up a much higher percentage of those who initially do not pass the exam. So if you looked at foundations of reading, minority teachers make up 9.35% or so of the teachers who pass on the first attempt, but 1/4, 25.51% of those who fail foundations of reading on their first attempt. You see similar patterns for the other two Pearson exams. Foreshadowing the predictive validity results I'm going to show in a minute, you'll see up in the top panel there's a row for a composite evaluation rating. All we've done there is sum teachers' ratings across the 5 standards and an EVOS index. And you'll see the biggest difference between those who pass and fail on the first attempt for those teacher performance measures are for foundations of reading, and the differences for the multi-subject and the mathematics exam are pretty minimal. And finally, in the bottom, when you're looking at school characteristics, these aren't particularly large differences to my mind, but you do see that those who initially pass these licensure exams tend to be working in schools with slightly fewer economically disadvantaged and minority students, and schools that are slightly higher performing, whether you're looking at a performance composite, the school performance grade, or the percentage of schools that were low performing. And before I move into the value added and evaluation actual results, I'll just pause really quick to see if anybody has a question thus far.
Oh, fascinating.
Okay, so we're going to look at predictive validity now. We're looking at the relationships between 2 licensure exams, and you see it over on the left side, foundations of reading at the top and the multi-subject exam at the bottom, and teachers' EVOS estimates in K through 2 reading. So this is from the M class, and it's particularly from the TRC, the text reading and comprehension portion of that exam, because that's where teachers get an EVOS estimate. The red bars are results from our screening analyses. And again, that's asking whether those who initially pass are more effective than those who initially fail. The blue bars from signaling analyses, just asking whether a higher score is predictive of performance. Again, sort of throwing out that caveat that the multi-subject exam is not just about reading or English language arts, so we have less of an a priori sense that it should predict teacher value added in K2 reading, for instance. But what we do see here is that those who pass foundations of reading on the first attempt have value-added estimates for K2 reading that are 21% of a standard deviation higher than their peers who initially fail the exam. That's statistically significant. And to benchmark that result a little bit for you, we often try to do that by looking at the average difference in the effectiveness between first and second year teachers. And that difference varies based on the test or the grade level. But across sort of all tests, looking at EVOS estimates, the average difference in effectiveness between a first and second year teacher is about 15% of a standard deviation. So this gives you a sense that it's a slightly larger difference perhaps than the average difference between a first and second year teacher, if that makes it a little bit more meaningful. The signaling result for foundations of reading isn't statistically significant. You'll see it's not, there's no asterisk or anything like that up there, that 8.5. But I would note that in a separate model, when we're looking at K2 reading and we control for both the foundations of reading score and the multi-subject exam score at the same time, the signaling result for foundations of reading is positive and significant. Lastly, at the bottom, and again, this isn't necessarily surprising, but there's no relationship between the multi-subject exam and K2 reading teacher value added.
That's good. Glad to hear that.
All right, so now we turn to upper elementary grades. So we're shifting away from the M class to the end of grade exam. And in signaling analyses or screening analyses for foundations of reading or the multi-subject exam, there's no relationship, statistically significant relationship between early career teachers' scores on the assessments and their value-added estimates. Now looking at math.
Dr. Bastian, Dr. Bastian, could you say that last statement again for me? I'm sorry, I missed it.
Yeah, that's fine. So we're looking at teachers' EVOS estimates in grades 3 through 6 reading, so the EOG. And what we see here is neither in the screening or signaling analyses, nor for foundations of reading or the multi-subject exam, none of those results are statistically significant. So no relationship.
So it wasn't no statistical significance at all with that small sample, right?
Yeah, for the sample we have, there's no significant relationship between these two Pearson exams and upper elementary grades reading.
Thank you.
Certainly.
That makes sense to me.
So our last value-added slide, this is looking at scores on the general curriculum mathematics Pearson exam and teachers' EVOS estimates in grades 4 through 6 math. Much like the previous slide, there's no relationship here between teachers' mathematics exam scores and the EVOS estimates that they receive in mathematics. I would say that to sort of dive into this one just a little bit further or give a little bit more interpretation, it's a relatively small sample here. I think it's 300 to 400 cases, as I remember. But it's not as if the estimates are also not large, I'll say that. It's not as if we have very large estimates and we just sort of don't have statistical power to detect an effect at this point. At least with this sample, these are relatively small estimates as well. All right, so now we're going to shift to look at another, certainly relevant teacher outcome, and that's the evaluation ratings on the state's 5 professional teaching standards. Since evaluation ratings are sort of content neutral, at least relative to EVOS, where it's for 5th grade math, hypothetically, right? Our main analyses that we're seeing on this slide, slide 10, are considering how performance on all 3 licensure exams, sort of as a whole or at the same time, is predicting evaluation ratings. So the red bar, the screening analyses, what we're looking at is whether a candidate or a teacher passed all 3 licensure exams on the first try are those who pass all three on the first try more effective than those who fail at least one on the first try? And what we see, all those red bars for, for each of the 5 standards are positive and statistically significant. So they are, people who pass all 3 in the first attempt are receiving higher evaluation ratings. For instance, to give an example, those who pass all 3 in the first attempt have ratings on the facilitating student learning standard about 12% of a standard deviation higher than peers who have failed at least one of the exams on their first attempt. To put this into perspective for you, again, benchmarking it against first and second year teachers, the average evaluation rating differences between a first and a second year teacher is about 1/3 of a standard deviation, or 33% of a standard deviation. So these are actually smaller in some ways in magnitude than the EVOS K2 foundations of reading result we saw earlier. We also averaged teachers' scores on all 3 licensure exams, and then we predicted whether their average score, standardized, is predicting evaluation ratings. That's the blue bar, the signaling analyses. And we see that for 4 out of the 5 standards, higher scores on all 3 of the tests combined are also predicting higher evaluation ratings. To dive into those evaluation results just a little bit more, we wanted to be able to see if there's a particular assessment in the 3 licensure exams that's sort of carrying more of the weight and is more predictive of evaluation ratings. So slide 11 is showing a model seeing whether foundations of reading, the multi-subject, or the mathematics exam is especially predictive. And what we see here is that, again, it's sort of foundations of reading there that is predicting higher evaluation ratings on 3 of the 5 standards: leadership, classroom environment, and reflecting on practice. And there's insignificant results for everything else.
Strange.
So I would wrap up, or at least start the wrap up by saying these are, relatively early analyses with, with a relatively small sample, particularly when, it's about 1,120 teachers again. And I think what that really means is, I guess what I'd like to then say is this research can certainly guide evidence-based decisions, and it should, with sort of the caveat and the caution that, those decisions shouldn't be taken too far for the data we currently have, right? As a summary again, results indicate that the Foundation's reading scores are predicting higher EVOS estimates in K2 reading, but not for upper elementary grades in reading. The general curriculum multi-subject exam is unrelated to EVOS estimates in K2 reading and for the upper elementary grades reading. I would add that we did run analyses looking at the relationship between the multi-subject exam and EVOS estimates in 5th grade science, because part of the multi-subject exam does have science. Nothing was statistically significant, but they were, particularly in the screening analysis, it was decently positive. It was a fairly large coefficient, but the sample size was about 120. So there, it seemed underpowered at that point. The mathematics exam is unrelated to EVOS estimates in upper elementary grades and 6th grade. And again, results are more robust and positive for the evaluation ratings. I think particularly for foundations of reading, and how I think there could be very fruitful or interesting conversations intellectually about how you sort of interpret the value-added EVOS piece versus more the subjective principle evaluation piece.
Right.
Andrew, just Wesley, has this information been shared with our state board and/or our legislators?
Tom, do you want to? I mean, I don't believe so. No, I mean, this is something that we've shared within the UNC system and the UNC system office a little bit, and things that have been shared, with Dr. Tomberlin here at DPI, but I don't believe beyond that.
Yeah, and I believe this was done for us because we're having the conversation about these 3 particular licensure exams.
This is Glenda. I guess my question would be on all of that, because when I look at the high-level takeaways that Dr. Bastian or someone put together there, I think that's a lot of that supports what we've been talking about, not just as a commission, but in the field. And to Dr. McIntyre's point about the foundations of reading being a strong indicator, I think that even though this is a relatively small sample, that you do have some data to support that. I guess what we would still argue from the field would be that we can provide the reading foundations staff development that you know, I understand is some of the best staff development that our teachers go through. And that would prepare them better than just taking a test and indicating by the fact that I can pass the test, I'm a better teacher. And I understand some of your data here indicates that, even though it's a small sample. But I think that's the one thing that we would continue to say is that there's just not a correlation all the way through here, with exception of maybe the reading foundations. But that could be provided at the district level with state-trained trainers.
Dr. Tomberlin.
Yeah. I have a question for Dr. Bastian that didn't occur to me till, I've seen this before, but it just occurred to me. The relationship between the evaluation ratings and, is that between the evaluation ratings and the licensure exam, performance on the licensure exam? So this goes back to the original statement of, so Ms. Jones, I would like to hear your thoughts on that. If we're saying the LEAs can determine whether a teacher's ready or good enough for the job, but what we're saying, what this data suggests is your method for doing that is highly correlated with the licensure exam, even though it's not correlated with EVOS. So why would, are you getting my point here, that if the exam is telling us whether you in the LEAs are going to find that teacher to be effective or highly effective in your evaluation process, then what really is the argument for removing the exam when it's giving us that indication, when it is signaling whether you're going to say that's a good teacher or not? So in that regard, it seems to be your own evaluation seems to be reinforcing the licensure exam's validity in this case. And
well, I would disagree with you, Tom, because I think he said the sampling was like 1,121, and I think what you would find that there may be some disparity across the state with how the evaluation system has been implemented. I think that's one of the reasons we're looking at now the principal evaluation system at tweaking that and bringing that more into date with what we are expecting of our administrators. I don't think you can tie the this very low sampling of research to I guess something that validates that licensure that testing should be a barrier to licensure, and that principals are not doing their jobs with evaluating teachers. The evaluation model is a growth model. It's not, this instrument where we just check off the boxes. It's a growth model. So we get a beginning teacher in that first year, and over the years, we expect them to grow on that model. I don't know that I can really defend what every district is doing in the state in that area, but what I can say is that should not be the correlation that we utilize to say that we're not going to give flexibility to teachers and granting them licensure in the state of North Carolina.
Tom, there's also a lot of other factors to think about as well, as far as their VT support plan, their coaching that's involved, the resources that the district has. So I think there's a lot of other factors that can impact that data as well.
So it seems like because there is the potential for a high degree of variability across the state, and given the perhaps small sample size, the results are valid. They are statistically significant, regardless of the sample size at this point. It would in my judgment, it seems that the results would indicate that the test is an important indicator when we think about performance, particularly in early grades reading, as well as in evaluation across the NISA standards for at least 4 of those 5. And so the test would be an important measure for us as we continue to think about accountability and standards for beginning teachers.
I mean, I guess
Michael, with your point, I guess I have a question there. Have we taken into consideration the teachers? Did the data include those teachers who maybe had the Reading Foundation's professional development as opposed to those who took the test?
Great question.
No, I mean, because here we're literally looking at the relationships between their test scores and you know their measures of performance, either EVAS or evaluation ratings. So if someone doesn't have a test score, you know, then they can't sort of
and the
show
first
up in
pass
the model.
means they wouldn't have taken those workshops, correct? Glenda, if they've passed the licensure exam, would they take those workshops? I wouldn't think so, right?
And even some people who have failed it might
you have districts right now that are proposing that we be able to give the Reading Foundation's training in lieu of making them take that test. And that's one of the things that we tried to address in the LICN 001, that if they're coming in from out of state, instead of having to take the test, they could have the option of taking the test, or they could take the Reading Foundation's or the Math Foundation's training.
Well, that would be interesting
Again,
data to see later on, right?
Sorry.
I think that would be interesting data to see in the future.
I guess trying to think more broadly and step back, I suppose. A couple high-level thoughts. First, just because these are 3 required assessments now for these 2 licensure areas doesn't mean that you have to treat them, at least from my perspective, doesn't mean you have to treat them all the same in some sort of decision about what to do with Pearson licensure exams, by which I simply mean if you decide to eliminate or tweak one, that doesn't mean, of course, that you would need to do that for all 3. I think that's you know, worth stating, although I think clear. Second, if you, I guess there's a couple qualifications in exam, and I can't speak to all these qualifications, but you would want a licensure exam to sort of meet to be used for high stakes decisions. Certainly you'd want, you know, reliability. We haven't looked at that. Second, you would sort of want alignment, and I know we haven't, but I know others have certainly talked about the alignment between some of these exams and what then teachers in these grades are being asked to teach, right? You want that alignment there, you want reliability, and then you want what we're looking at. You want predictive validity, right? You want to be able to say to a teacher that if you're going to make a high-stakes decision about his or her employment or potential employment, that there is actually a relationship there between how they're going to score or you know, how they score and then how they're going to do on average. And this is all on average, and I think, you know, that's worth saying too. You know, there are teachers who don't pass and then do well. There are teachers who pass and then don't do well as teachers. But on average, these are the relationships we're seeing. So I think, you know, all that's worth saying. I mean, clearly the state has a role in ensuring that its teachers, and the states do this in multiple ways, you know, having educator prep programs with certain requirements, having licensure exams, etc. But a state, North Carolina, certainly has a role in ensuring that the people that come in to teach its children are prepared to do so. I think licensure exams are certainly one way to go about that. And I think you know, that can sort of stop there, some high-level thoughts on sort of what these results might mean.
This is Hank. And Glenda, I think one other thing that I think about with this is especially the foundations of reading tests. The other 2 I don't see any use for right now, the ones that we've selected, but it provides a particular kind of quality control for our EPPs, in that up until the time we had the Pearson exam, it wasn't always true that every university was using research-based reading foundations teaching in their programs, phonemics-based teaching. They were all over the place. This test at least makes sure that the coursework is aligned with what we know is true about reading, especially K2 reading and those early interventions. I think if you take that away, you might see some of that slip away from some of our programs, and I wouldn't want that to happen. And I don't think that that's a good practice for the state.
I agree.
Hi, this is Robin Hyatt. I just wanted to weigh in with a point, just thinking about, is there a strong correlation between the exam and the course? I have taken the course before, and it's high quality, it's great professional development. I felt like it was centered a lot on diagnosing reading problems and the interventions that teachers need to use to address those. So it was, I don't feel like it was comprehensive enough for a general ed setting. But however, I mean, it was great. But I'm not sure that it would directly correlate with the exam.
Have you taken the exam?
I have not.
I wonder if we could find people who have done both taken the exam and taken the course. I might have somebody in my faculty actually who's done both. I could ask her. She too says the course is fantastic. So it's an interesting question.
I guess a last thought, and this is, and perhaps this is coming from a academic position, and then so I recognize in saying it maybe not, it certainly doesn't ring true with many on this commission's present reality who are actually, you know, principals, teachers, district employees, etc. But I think there should be some caution in making decisions in the current state of teacher shortages when they didn't used to they're somewhat cyclical. They weren't always the case, and if I had to bet something, I would say they might not be again, and part of that's, and so I guess I would just sort of say that removing barriers to entry, which you might call licensure exams, now in response to a current situation may be reasonable, but X number of time from now, and of course they could always be reinstated, but X number of years from now, that situation could be quite different, hypothetically, and then you may be in a position where it'd be nice to be able to have more quality control. So I'll say that as well.
Great point.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bastian. So Dr. Tomberlin will follow up with the policy changes to LICN 003 for discussion and action. Actually, Dr. Tomberlin just stepped away. Can we take a, we're gonna take perhaps a 5-minute recess, if that's okay with everybody, and then we'll reconvene right at 10:35.
Good.
Okay.
just joined AQEP.
Did you?
Yeah. Parents working with. It's gonna be good.
Start fight. The mic's back on. Okay, we're ready to reconvene. And so now Dr. Tomberlin will follow up with the policy changes to LICN 003 for discussion and action.
Hello again. So LICN 003 is coming before the commission to reflect some feedback on the requirement of licensure tests for elementary school teachers. The legislation requires that a elementary teacher have a subtest of mathematics and reading, and given that the multi-subject test is not in legislation, we're recommending that assessment be removed from the requirements. And we can do so without any legislative action. Also, the recommendation to change the mathematics test from Pearson 203 to the Praxis 7803, the CKT math subtests. And for the required score here, we have talked to the testing company, and this is a recommended nationally normed score that they're recommending, but we can certainly, as we implement this test, we can look at the performance and adjust that score accordingly. And we make it clear that this is for licenses with an effective date of 7/1/2019 or later. So this would not be an option for anybody who is who has a licensure expiration date of 2019. I'm sorry, 6/30/2019. It would go into effect with the 7/1/2019 group.
Tom, this is Glenda. Can I ask a question about that, please?
Absolutely.
And I guess my fear here is we're going to end up in the same predicament going into this next year with our currently staffed folks that we've gotten a permit to teach. You know, not the ones outside of the normal permit, the ones that didn't pass by the end of their second year. And if we put the date off and to July 2019, why can't we just make that effective right now and the folks can have the option of doing it? Is there a reason why we can't do that? You understand what I'm asking?
Sure. So I think the reason that we considered when we talked about this was equity for those folks who are involved. So those teachers who took the test multiple times and eventually passed it, I think they certainly, and when I'm talking about Pearson 203, we just thought that would be unfair that we changed the rules of the game in the middle of the game for all those teachers. And
well, not really, because they passed the test. They're licensed. They're not in danger now of not having a job. Districts are not in danger of having another vacancy because these same teachers that we got a permit to teach across the state, because they keep what we're actually doing. And I understand. I mean, I do understand the rationale there. It's just we're going to end up with the same issue again. We've got teachers who are taking that same Pearson 203 over and over and over and are not passing it, and it's costs coming out of their pocket at $35,000 a year as a beginning teacher or a second-year teacher or a third-year teacher. What other reason outside of equity is there that we can't go ahead? If we're gonna, as a commission, say we're gonna go with the Pearson Foundations of Reading because of this reason, and now we're going to go with the Praxis 7803. We're gonna eliminate the general curriculum test. Why not give that as an option right now instead of putting it off to July?
I agree with Glenda as well, man. I think if we were looking at equity and we just arbitrarily changed the test, then that would be a concern. But we changed the test because the data indicated that we needed to help our teacher shortage.
Well, I
This
don't know
is Robin.
I don't know that we
I
changed.
also, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say I don't know that we're changing the test specifically because of the teacher shortage, but rather we're changing the test because the test is not indicative of effective teaching.
Yeah, that's what I said.
I agree with you, Michael. It's all those things bundled up into one big package for us. It's not an indicator of an effective teacher. It is a barrier to licensure, and that trickles down to being vacancies in the classroom and a teacher shortage. So it's all of those things. And I think you're right. We need to make sure we capture all of that because we're not doing it just in an isolated silo over here for one reason.
I agree. This is Connie. This is Robin. I agree too. We found out from our study that it doesn't correlate with the standards necessarily that our elementary teachers are teaching. Right now, I've got a kindergarten teacher who has spent $600 of her money on taking the test and test prep programs. So I would love to have that available for her now.
Okay. So after conferring with Mr. Snyder, it appears that we can make the recommendation that it becomes effective upon approval by the State Board of Education, which could potentially be February.
So just a point of clarity, my assumption is, and I'll need the commission to confirm that, is that you want what I would call a soft implementation. In other words, after the state board passes this, if a teacher passed 203, you would still want them to be granted licensure, right, as well as potentially passing CKT.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct. Okay. That's exactly correct.
I think we're all in agreement on that.
Great. We can certainly amend as suggested.
Great. Okay. Any other questions for Dr. Tomberlin?
Tom, can I just ask about the box underneath the red on page 2 where it says the Pearson General Curriculum, the 701. Are we going to cross that off? Because that's all of them bundled into one.
Where's that? What are you talking about?
Well, it's the one test that they could take that's the multi-subject and the math subtest all in one that they could take. And we've already proven that that's not a valid, the math subtest there is not a valid test, and we're going to use these others. Then would that box go away, I guess is my question, Tom, on page 2 and then again on the EC one?
So, yes, we can.
I'm just trying to make this clear.
We can remove that box, but I would like to state for the record.
A soft implementation.
Pearson might disagree with us that that's not a valid test. We are choosing not to use the test for the purposes of licensure. So, but yes.
Okay. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. That's my goal. I want to keep them happy.
Okay. So do we have a motion to approve the recommendation for the math content exam to be sent to the North Carolina State Board of Education in January?
So moved.
So can I ask one more thing before we or do we need the motion? Because I have another
so
question.
We have a
on page
motion.
4. I'm sorry.
We have a motion.
Okay. So say it again. I'm sorry, Michael. Would you repeat it?
So the motion is to approve the recommendation for the math content exam to be sent to the North Carolina State Board of Education in January. This would include the removal of the multi-subject test.
Can that motion include the fact that that Tom stated about or does it need to include that, Tom, about the fact that the current date thing?
It includes it.
We will.
Okay, and I make that motion.
It's been moved. Are you seconding?
Second.
I'll second the motion. I'll second.
Thank you. It's been properly moved and seconded. Do we have any further discussion? Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Abstain? Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tomberlin.
So Tom, before he leaves, I have another question on page 4 of that policy.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
No.
So on page 4 and on page 7 and 8, I thought somewhere when we first started as a commission, and Andrew may have to pipe in here, but that secondary shouldn't have to take the 5624 if they had passing TPA scores. And I don't see that on page 4, and I don't see that on page 7 with an asterisk underneath that the option is secondary would have to either take the 5624 or if they had passing ed TPA scores. I don't see that as an asterisk or a caveat.
So in Roman
I didn't go back and pull the minutes.
So on page 2, under Roman numeral 3, Principles of Learning and Teaching Exemption for Ed TPA and PPAT. Beginning on July 1st, 2018, a candidate will be exempt from the Principles of Learning and Teaching assessment requirement if the candidate can produce evidence of a passing score on a nationally scored Ed TPA or PPAT assessment.
So can that be included as one of the asterisks on the chart on page 7, at the bottom of page 7, and or on the Ed TPA, PPAT scores there? I'm just thinking about our licensure people. Our LEA licensure people like to take this chart here and have it printed out and just sticking there so they can answer questions about licensure instead of having to read through every word of the policy.
I got you. So you would like another footnote to that table that indicates a passing score on these assessments removes the requirement for the pre-professional, the PLT?
Yes, please.
We could do that. That's not substantive. That's just clarifying. So we can make that happen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Tomberlin. Next, we'll talk about the Administrative Procedure Act, the rules review process. Mr. Eric Snyder, General Counsel for the NC State Board of Education, will discuss the rules review process that is now a requirement for NCDPI policies that serve external stakeholders.
Good morning, Commissioners. Eric Snyder here. Pleased to be here today to talk about everyone's favorite topic, the Administrative Procedure Act and permanent rulemaking. This morning, we have a couple things I'd like to take the Commission through. One, I want to set the table and talk about why we're in fact talking about rulemaking today, provide you a little bit of history and context for this discussion, talk about a new analytical framework that the agency and the PEPC will need to take on as we consider policies and rules, especially those that impact those outside of the DPI building, and then talk a little bit about some recommendations about process for PEPC as it moves forward in this new world. So we'll start here at the beginning about our actors. As you all know, the State Board of Education has under our state constitution the responsibility to supervise and administer our system, subject to the laws enacted by the General Assembly. This last line here in Article 9, Section 5 of the Constitution has been the subject of some litigation, and we've got some clarity from our courts about what that means, and in particular as it impacts administrative procedures. The board, of course, acts through its policies and the rules that it enacts to meet those constitutional duties. Now, one of the key pieces of legislation that we have to consider now is the Administrative Procedure Act. And as you may or may not know, this is the law that the General Assembly has passed that outlines the process for agencies to establish regulations. And so this came about in the 70s. A lot of states implemented similar acts. There's a federal act, of course. And the state created a Rules Review Commission back in 1986. Now, the goal for this act is it's all sort of good government work, right? Transparent governance for agencies as they enact rules, set of safeguards for procedure for those who are impacted by new regulations, process to allow for public input and comment. If you pick up the administrative code, you'll see that there is uniformity. The rules look the same, so people know what to expect when they pick up the rules and try to understand what applies to them. Also, it sets up safeguards to make sure that agencies are acting within their bounds, that they're not subjecting the public to overreach. So it's all in the name, right? This is a procedural act, and the Rules Review Commission that examines rules offered by agencies really is looking at the process by which an agency is promulgating those regulations. It's not about the wisdom of the rule, necessarily the substance of the rule, but the procedure. Did you all go through the right steps to accomplish these 5 goals that are listed on the screen here with respect to public comment? Does it look the right way? Do you have authority to make a rule if you're an agency? Okay. So why are we talking about this today? After the Administrative Procedure Act passed, the state board voluntarily participated in it and submitted rules to the Rules Review Commission, and you can find those in the administrative code today. Now, back in 2014, before Pepsi existed and before I was here, the state board took a different view on this. It looked at its constitutional authority and said, hey, we're a constitutional actor here. We have broad responsibilities. We should be able to proceed accordingly, and sought clarity from the courts about what its obligations were with respect to administrative procedure. So they filed suit back in 2014 and sought courts' clarity on that. Well, fast forward to this past summer in June, the Supreme Court did indeed provide that clarity in a decision that came down 5-2. And bottom line, the state board, as it enacts policies and rules, is subject to the Administrative Procedure Act. So if it wants to have a regulation that affects third parties, and it wants that regulation to have the force of law, it needs to go through the Administrative Procedure Act, just as other agencies do. Now, this is different than what the board had been doing. Essentially, its position for a number of years during the litigation was that its policy manual had the force of law, and it acted in that way. So, some years removed from taking that position, we're in a new world now. Maybe it's the old world again, but under new circumstances. So the board is, and others here in the agency and the Pepsi Commission and other advisory councils to the board have to think about their policies and guidance differently now. Now, does that mean that every piece of policy or guidance that the board wants to pass, that Pepsi wants to recommend, needs to end up in the administrative code and put in front of the Rules Review Commission? Well, the answer to that is no. Nevertheless, it is an important framework that our agency is working on, our board is working on, this Pepsi group will as well. So as you all make recommendations, and as the board considers policy recommendations from the department and other stakeholders, it really needs to put those policies into one of 3 buckets. Is this something that really ought to be in the administrative code? Do we need a rule that functions like the law, that functions as law? Is it, number 2, an internal agency rule, a piece of governance? Or is it 3, I've got policy here in quotes, because we throw around this word policy quite a bit, but policy means different things in different contexts and with whom it may depend on who you're talking to. Policy here would be guidance documents, best practices, ones that if we went into court don't have the same force that a law does. It's not a firm shall. This sort of breaks down, this is sort of the analytical framework on this next slide here on slide 10, just breaking down these buckets a little bit more. All right, so the court's ruling has those here in the agency and a lot of my colleagues both looking forward and also looking back. So what happens to those rules that exist in the state board's policy manual? Well, we already have some administrative rules that are on the books in Chapter 16 of the Administrative Code. those rules that are already codified will be up for review before the Rules Review Commission, and the agency will be working with the Office of Administrative Hearings to facilitate that review. But what about all those policies that are in the board's policy manual that are online, including the licensure and EPP policies that are out there? Well, there's 324 of them, give or take 5 or 10. And those policies in the manual have been elevated by statute this summer, through session law this summer, to have the status of interim rules. Essentially, House Bill 374 in this highlighted language elevated the policy manual to the level of rules to give the agency some time to begin migrating items in the policy manual to the administrative code. Not everything, just those items that really need that rise to the level of rule or law. Now, the important piece to note here is that there is a timeline on this interim rule status. So the agency needs to take certain steps to take existing policies that it wants to move into the administrative code by May of next year. So while we have the luxury of, while the board's rules have the force of law at this point, that carriage turns back into a pumpkin in late spring next year. Now, time moves awfully quick. I mean, I'm very pleased that the General Assembly recognized a need to provide for some transition for the board and this agency and the recommendations that PEPC has made. But that May 19 date really is, it's some comfort, but it's maybe perhaps illusory comfort. Part of this process in moving items to the administrative code includes getting fiscal notes, so working with OSBM to understand the cost of new rules. That is a lengthy process and an in-depth one. While the Rules Review Commission staff has offered a great deal of assistance, that's going to take time to do pre-reviews of rules that the department and the board want to move over. We also have timelines with respect to how the state board and PEPC and other advisory committees meet. It's not a lot of time. Also, there's significant agency capacity issues in accomplishing these goals. Simply, we haven't done this work for some time. We don't have people with a great deal of experience who've done this previously. So, next steps. Despite those challenges, know that we are moving deliberately and with great energy to get this task done as best we can. Right now, staffers across the agency, including those you're familiar with who are in this room, are picking up policies that the board has passed. They're reviewing them, doing some analysis to figure out, what bucket does this particular policy belong in? We really need to move this item to the administrative code. Is this a governance rule here at the agency, or is this just something that really is policy and best practice or guidance for those in the field? I realize we're getting a bit astray here, but I think it's important for PEPC to understand what work is going on here at the agency, because it will inform the work that we're going to do together for licensure and EPP policies. But in any event, part of this work is looking at revision and repeal of policies that are no longer applicable or need some tweaks. Probably about the fourth bullet down is an important piece here as well. We're working to identify places where the agency would have could ask for a targeted exemption to APA rulemaking. Where are there places where, to accomplish good things and the best things for the state, we can make a solid case that the Administrative Procedure Act ought not to apply to particular work here at the agency. So, as part of this process, as we think about licensure and EPP policies, staffers have already met with the Rules Review Commission and its staff. The team over at Office of Administrative Hearings has been very helpful, very supportive, and always available to answer the questions that we've proposed already. Certainly the work that we do here creates work for them. So we understand that it's a journey we will take together as we deal with these policies and new rules. I provided some additional resources for y'all if you really want to dig in deep on these rules review questions over the holidays or in your spare time. But OAH has a number of resources that we're using and staffers here at the agency are getting familiar with. And you know what this really means for DPI, for the state board, and for Pepsi is rulemaking is going to mean we need to think about timelines as we have to comply with the APA to get get rules that have the force of law. We need to understand how we need to understand implementation dates. We need to be realistic about how long it takes to get a rule passed. The implications of getting additional public notice. Working with those who can help us craft fiscal notes and better understand the fiscal impacts of rules that Pepsi would recommend to the board. We also have to understand that Administrative Procedure Act provides perhaps a great deal of certainty because the rules get locked in, but the trade-off is that we lose the agility to adjust to market conditions to address what's happening in classrooms now. So these are real challenges. Also, it means that if we're going to recommend that the state board advance something to rulemaking out of Pepsi, we're going to need to do some risk evaluation as well. Is this really a recommendation that needs to have the force of law? Do we need the ability to defend the licensure decisions that folks may challenge because that policy is so important, that rule that Pepsi recommends is so important? The same is true with respect to setting up rules for accountability for EPPs. Now, on this next slide, which I don't think anyone can see, even if they've got it on printed out in front of them, is a flow chart about permanent rulemaking. And just a slight diversion here. We go through a pretty, I think, a pretty tight communications loop between Pepsi and the state board. This group was designed to facilitate public input, transparency, expertise in all these topics that fall within Pepsi's jurisdiction. You all serve a great service for the board in providing these recommendations and really bringing to bear input and expertise from all corners of these important issues concerning licensure, teacher prep, accountability, work with higher ed and other education prep providers. Our process now really kind of ends at the first box on this sheet, which if you squint closely talks about agency action to propose text. I mean, for us, the rulemaking process would really begin after the steps that we go through here. Pepsi making a recommendation, the board adopting it. We'd have to sort of figure out how to work in some work with respect to fiscal notes, talking about the impacts of particular rules. But once the board blesses a recommendation and sends it forth, it essentially makes a decision to have it ready to be published in the North Carolina Register. And then a long process begins to ensure those goals set out in the Administrative Procedure Act about public comment, about transparency and the like. So in some ways, this is not unlike going to the amusement park with your kids or grandkids and you get in line and you think you're at the front of the line with the work that you've done, and then you round the corner and it's like, oh, okay, now the line really begins. The rulemaking process can move as quickly as 6 months. Sometimes it can take up to 18 months. Throw in complexity with the fiscal notes, that can prolong the process even more, which again creates challenges. So in any event, if you sort of work through the list here, and I won't touch on it exhaustively, if Pepsi were to make a recommendation to the board and the board were to adopt it, assuming the fiscal note is in order, the agency publishes that text in the North Carolina Register. There's a process then for public feedback and public comment. The agency would then address comments provided by the public, we would need to work a way to have Pep-C understand and review some of those public comments. Many of them would probably be from your colleagues who you already represent, because we already have a process for providing input. The board and Pep-C would address those public comments and then ultimately present them to the Rules Review Commission, assuming it decided to proceed forward with a proposed recommendation. And then if you get to sort of the very bottom of this flow chart, you'll see that the Rules Review Commission has a number of options that it can take with respect to its rules. So, I mean, I don't think I could provide a higher level overview of the somewhat arcane rulemaking process. But what that means is for any new recommendation that Pep-C would present to the board, this process or a temporary rulemaking process is what would need to occur after the board's blessing. Now, this is also the same kind of process that we're going to go through, writ large for all those policies that live in the state board's policy manual that really need to be elevated to the administrative code. So you can imagine this is a daunting lift as we shrink that 300 plus policies to the workable, appropriate number of rules that really do need to be in law. And I will say that the appetite here from talking with staffers and talking with the board members is we certainly do not want to move the entire manual over. That doesn't make any sense to do, but there are certain policies that really do need to make their way into the administrative code for the board's policies and objectives to be enforced in the best way. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide here regarding Pep-C. Of course, you all are very aware of your role already. What's particularly of mind to me here is that you all already involve stakeholders in this process. From all corners of the state, from all sort of angles of these issues, you already bring to bear that expertise. And you bring that expertise to bear on the rule recommendations that you make. The recommendations you make may change as you operate in the shadow of the Administrative Procedure Act. When we talked about Pep-C's role in subcommittees back in the spring, I've just basically copy-pasted those initial bullet points, but have added this additional piece at the very bottom about Pep-C providing assistance with respect to APA analysis. One of the things that this group will need to consider and can make recommendations on is, is the recommendation we suggest really one that ought to go into rulemaking? That ought to go through that process, end up in the administrative code. These next handful of slides sort of get really nitty gritty and wonky. I'm happy to talk with folks afterwards or online about these. But the staff over at OAH has done some breakdowns for us on understanding differences between rules and policies. Again, this is part of the framework that we've been adopting and understanding better here at the agency as we make decisions about what we ought to push forward to the RRC. One thing that an administrative rule is not is a restatement of the law. So we're going to be very careful about that as we move forward. But as we look at the legislation for Pep-C and the board with respect to licensure and EPPs, it's very clear that it's the job of these two groups to establish rules. So I think our default is going to be more often than not, we might want to move this through, we might want to move things through administrative rulemaking. At least that's my thought right now. We'll see as we move forward. But I'm going to give these next couple slides some short shrift. But in any event, I do think it's sort of worth clarifying here that, those items that end up in rules, again, they're not going to be about how Pep-C governs itself or how DPI governs itself. And it's not going to be these, well, you think you should do something, school districts or IHEs or EPPs. And these are really the shall sort of comments in these rules. Shall is the word shall, as in you shall do something, is really the kind of item that would move forward through administrative rulemaking. Okay. Now, there are certain exceptions that have been granted to DPI and the board. And so the APA, this is here in 115C 270-15 for those keeping score at home. there is a recognition that with respect to minimum cut scores on exams, that's a piece that doesn't need to go through rulemaking. There's been a recognition by the legislature that that's not the kind of thing that we want to move through the APA process. Now, I imagine if we ran around the table in here, commissioners would have plenty of ideas about work that they think is similar in nature to these minimum kinds of cut scores that merit an exemption. Okay, so what next? You know, at this point in time, as we've been working to understand and set plans forth for addressing rulemaking here at the agency, folks internally have done work to educate staffers here at the agency, coach up the state board, and also PEPC. So we're doing that work of educating folks here who are in this space. As I mentioned, there's a broad review of the board's policy manual. Business owners throughout the agency are really digging in some cases, blowing the dust off of policies that need to sunset, identifying places where revision's appropriate, and then prioritizing certain items that need to go forward through rulemaking. I think the consensus here is, with respect to licensure-related policies, you know, barring some sort of exemption, those are a very high priority for this agency. And to the extent there have been, you know, we're doing some work with OSBM with respect to fiscal notes for existing policies and new ones. And we have some very strong assurances that fiscal notes will not be required to address those policies that were existing at the time the court's decision came down. But we're going to have to sort through with them, you know, what policies may require fiscal notes moving forward. So business owners here across the agency are sort of running through that analysis and doing that work. We are also trying to identify the places of greatest need that need resources to get this done. There have been requests in the budget to bring in additional folks, you know, a dedicated rules review coordinator, as every agency must have. You know, right now we have Dr. Deanna Townsend-Smith in the board office filling the full-time rules review coordinator role on top of her other full-time role, which I think if you asked anyone is not sustainable. So we're seeking additional positions and budget requests, and those were talked about in the state board meeting, not this past month, but the month before. Also some internal discussion about repurposing some open positions to help staff up this very important endeavor. You know, long term, and perhaps by long term, I mean maybe next session, I think it's important for members of the PEPC to think long and hard about what compliance with the APA does to this group's effectiveness, and perhaps consider asking for additional legislative fixes, I'll call them, or some sort of assistance with respect to this process. Universities, for example, are exempt from the APA. Query whether DPI and the state board ought to seek out that kind of exemption as well. If that seems like too big of an ask, perhaps it's a request for more time to get this work done. For this group that works on the important issues of licensure and educator prep and has an apparatus that, let me turn back my slides here, that accomplishes many of the same goals that the APA does. Transparent governance, procedural safeguards, a method for public input and comment. We can address issues of uniformity of what the policies look like, protecting against agency overreach. This PEPC group accomplishes many of the things, if not all of the things, that the Administrative Procedure Act aims to support. So query whether this group raises its voice with the state board to seek seek legislative intervention with respect to rulemaking. So those are some of the fixes that we're considering right now and are certainly open to others. But again, over the short and long term, the immediate need is to address those existing policies concerning licensure and EPPs, move those forward and start that process to get those items in the administrative code that need to be in the administrative code, and then consider work forward and what that looks like, adjusting to timelines and the unique turnover of this group, and the challenges that APA places on each of your short tenures with Pep-C. It will be difficult to see things all the way through. I mean, starting on day one, it may take 12, 18, 24 months to get some fixes through into the administrative code. So having run through that, I'm happy to answer some questions and entertain some discussion about rulemaking. I realize this is sort of a high-level overview and one that talks a bit about Pep-C, but recognize that the work that Pep-C does on this is the same kinds of inquiries that others throughout this agency are asking about their programs as well, and in particular how the guidance that the board blesses and recommends and puts into effect from experts here at the agency, how the board best achieves its end, whether it's through guidance or whether it's through really promulgating a regulation as a force of law.
So, Eric, this is Glenda. May I ask you a question, please?
Please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so a couple questions. I'm curious as to, with this presentation, is this in any way an indicator that the policies that we just recommended to go to the state board in January are going to be stalled from going until we can make a decision whether or not they're going to go into the administrative code?
Well, it's a great question. I think one of the big challenges with respect to the very complex and detailed licensure policies is trying to incorporate these important changes while also moving the previously agreed upon policies and sort of the infrastructure of this enterprise into the administrative code. We're working internally to figure out what that fix looks like and how we move it forward. It's going to be challenging. We're also sort of working to better understand.
I want to be clear on that.
I'm sorry.
Eric, I need to be clear on what you're saying. Are you saying that the policies that we just voted on to go forward to the January State Board of Education meeting are going to be delayed at DPI because we need to decide on whether or not they go into the administrative code, whereas any other changes we've made to licensure policy, we've not done that. We've sent those on the state board. Are you now saying that's going to happen?
No, I will continue to move things from Pep-C to the state board. The question will be, what for an outsider, what bucket does this go in? Is this just guidance from the agency, or is this something with the force of law? And I'll be honest with you. I want to be very sort of circumspect here in a public meeting about what some of those consequences might be for those who might challenge agency, board policy on some of these issues. But the shorter answer is we're working towards a solution now, and those items that have existed do have the force of law at this point in time. And with respect to the policies that y'all are recommending that the state board would approve, many of those are going to, I think it sort of depends on your audience, right? For those with an agency who are working on those recommendations, how they begin to implement them is one thing. Their value in force to the public is another. And I have to be careful about that because the Rules Review Commission and others have viewpoints about how things ought to function while a proposed rule moves through the process.
Okay, so Eric, I agree with that. So the Rules Review Commission, we need to make sure that the viewpoints of superintendents in the state of North Carolina HR administrators in the state of North Carolina and principals, all of those in the field who have to implement these things on a day-to-day basis, that those are the viewpoints being considered. And then my second part of that question would be, who are the NCDPI business owners? Is this an organized group in the state that's actually looking at all the policies?
Well, that's a great question. I think you already know your business owners with respect to the policies you see. Kim, Andrew, and Tom, and their colleagues. I will tell you that the legal office, ostensibly me and the new assistant general counsel who just joined us last week, are also reviewing these policies. So you can imagine if you read through, so this isn't just unique to the items that cross your desk, Ms. Jones. You know, across the agency, you know, those business owners who come forward and offer policies to the board in terms of asking for recommendations and for blessing, you know, they're the ones who are doing this initial lift, trying to categorize policies, and then we will be working through legal to determine, you know, what really needs to move forward. But again, there is a significant agency capacity issue right now, as we don't have a dedicated rules review coordinator position yet. We don't have an admin to support that person. School business and others in accounting's ability and capacity to accomplish fiscal notes remains a significant challenge as they try to keep the wheels on this bus. So I don't want to downplay the significant challenges that DPI is in the state board and groups like Pepsi are facing with respect to this process.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Snyder.
Thank you very much.
Now, Dr. Andrew Seiberg will present a bill that has been drafted regarding EPP performance data for discussion.
Good morning, everyone. Just a couple slides on this. This is the 2019 MK1. What I'm going to do here is sort of walk through some highlights. There's a little PowerPoint associated with it. And then what I'd like to do is invite Dr. Dempsey to share some of his insights as he's been a part of some of the input process in this. But this is to make sure that you all are aware of what's happening over on the legislative side in terms of drafts that affect EPP accountability. So the first thing is in terms of the current accountability expectations in 599, they're listed on slide 2 there. That the accountability model needs to have performance on teacher evaluations included, as well as EVOS, where it's applicable, results on the recent graduate survey, so folks that are just out of an EPP program in their first year. That's a survey that we collect. And then the fourth component is the quality of students entering the EPP through their GPA or pre-professional skills. So those are four that are currently in law. And then this modified law that's being sort of developed right now is including some additional layers of accountability. And this is where they're seeking input from a variety of stakeholders. One is one of these new accountability measures is employment of EPP completers, including the number of students employed as beginning teachers under initial professional licenses within the first year of the completing the program. And the second is the number of students retained in the profession and the perseverance of BTs in the profession. So how long they're staying as measured by their employment through the retirement system, that they're continuing to exist in the retirement system. Also in this, these changes is a small group exception, and this is basically, we have institutions and EPPs that are very small, that have very small sample sizes, and so this is allowing for the development of a model that will allow and accommodate and also hold accountable these small groups. And that may include looking at data over multiple years. It's something that I've brought to this commission to consider a couple of months ago. But the idea is if your EPP is not producing enough data in the current year, can we look at data over multiple years to reach a significant sample size to be able to talk about the effectiveness of that EPP? And then let's see here. The last is that that Pepsi, this organization, as well as the state board, are charged with the development of the actual weighted model. So to look at the additional components that have been brought forth in this potential legislation, as well as any other measures that this commission and the subgroups that are working on it deem as important in the process, to sort of bundle that all together and create a weighted model. And then that weighted model, while it's not necessarily enacted quite yet, but the actual ironed out model should go in front of the Joint Legislative Education Oversight Committee by next fall. And then that model, the weighted model, be applied beginning in 2021. So that's what's actually written out and proposed. And I'd like to, this is sort of an FYI, but I also want to include Dr. Dempsey in his conversations that he's had with NCDPI staff over the past couple of weeks about this as well, and voice some of his concerns and to sort of flesh out more of the story and context. Dr. Dempsey, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
The EPP subcommittee, which includes Aaron Fleming, Megan Loftus, and Ellen McIntyre, and myself, had a meeting back in late November. Andrew and Kimberly and I had worked out some of the framing of this, and the draft of the legislation itself I had seen, and I believe that draft has been seen by representatives from the private institutions of higher ed and the UNC system institutions around the question of accountability for the EPPs. And so the subcommittee met. I had a set of sort of general questions and language issues and concerns I had already sent back. But we also had feedback that came in from the institutions of higher education. Subcommittee met on the 26th, and some basic elements of our conversations Andrew's already cited, but I did want to mention that there were a few that came up in the conversation with the subcommittee around how accountability mechanisms are going to speak to issues like some elements of preparation, like classroom management, teacher support, mentoring, coaching, the avoidance of single measures or loading too many consequences or too much of the weight of consequences on singular measures. We also have talked about, and Andrew and Kimberly have sent out some examples of information we already have available through DPI relative to accountability. There are 4 required areas that are in the legislation on page 9 in Senate Bill 599 that people should go back and look at, and we will look at in the subcommittee. We also had questions about how expectations in 599 map to the draft legislation. Examples that have been pulled from other states, and I think, Andrew, that came from SREB. I don't have that in front of me.
Yeah, that was the SREB did an analysis of accountability models from I think 7 or 8 different states, and so that subcommittee has that data. SREB provided that information to us in kind, so we were able to share with the subcommittee how are other states looking at accountability as we think about our own accountability model.
Right. And then one last piece to mention, we talked about in the subcommittee how for the public institutions, for example, the expectations of our accrediting body may either map to and speak to what might be expected under this legislation, or where there are gaps, what's not cited. So we would have those examples from other states. We would have data, it was 7 data components that have been identified by DPI that will be talking through in the subgroups, in the subcommittee's work, and then what some of those elements that are in common with the accrediting bodies might look like. And so I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, Andrew, the challenge before our subcommittee, and the subcommittee, I can't remember the formal title, Andrew Lockus, if you're there, or Andrew Cyber, what's the title of the other subcommittee?
I think that's the accountability subcommittee.
No, assessment.
Assessment and performance, sorry. Assessment and performance.
We've talked, the chairs across the subcommittees have talked with Andrew to make sure we understand how the work of the two subcommittees are complementing each other. And I'm actually going to participate in their conference call, I think, with next week. And the subcommittee will come back to the commission in 2019 as we work through this to determine the expectations of the timeline that it references.
You're trailing off a little bit, Dr. Dempsey, if you could be a little closer to the mic.
Yeah, the last piece was about timeline. We've got these two subcommittees that are going to be working parallel to each other. At some point, they will merge in terms of the substance of the two subcommittees, but our goal is to try to meet the expectations that we'd have to meet the timeline in the spring of 2019 to set up for the benchmarks that happen later in the year. And others on the subcommittee, please feel free to chime in. But Andrew, did I miss any of the major points?
No, I think that helps flesh it out a little bit. Are there any questions about this?
I think I would just, so I've looked at this bill already, and I would encourage others to take a look and provide some feedback. I have a number of issues with it, particularly if we're going to call it a performance dashboard, and then to include a number of input measures that are unrelated to performance. In particular, just as an example on page 2, the number of students who apply, admitted, retained, that has nothing to do with performance. So we've got issues there, and then I think there are additionally some issues in which EPPs can't be held accountable. Beyond 2 years in the field, the impact of the EPP, that's beyond our control whether or not someone stays in the profession after 2 years. I think that's an unfair
Michael, I can't hear you. Would you say it's what is beyond our control?
Whether or not a candidate or a graduate remains in the field beyond 2 years. Once they get past that 2-year point, there are a host of school factors that determine whether or not someone remains in the profession or within a given school. I just don't think that's a good measure by which to evaluate teacher prep programs. So in addition to these input measures, there are some things beyond our control. And then I think thirdly, finally, there are some other issues that we are already required to report either through federal Title II or through the IHE performance report. This just adds more reporting requirements on individuals at EPPs who are already completing multiple reports. And I'm not convinced anyone reads these reports. So that's just my kind of personal feedback.
Michael, this is Van. That issue that you just raised, among others, has come up in preliminary conversations. There have been questions so far about the structure of the data collection process, and so what's going to be on the institution, what can be done at the central level, and how it's related to a dashboard. Questions about resources as to how to fund that. The benchmarking part of the process, and so the way the legislation reads right now is, in essence, institutions are benchmark against each other. So how do you perform? How does institution A perform relative to institution B versus performance relative to a standard of practice? And so the comparative aspect of that really doesn't tell us much about quality. It just says something about how institutions are performing relative to each other. The issue you just mentioned about, which points to context, so the way some of the variables are going to play out around retention, for example, will be contingent upon the district in which the candidate teaches and what resources are available, what kind of professional development supports are going to be available to the on behalf of the candidate once the candidate goes into a position. The issues of time, so how long after the candidate leaves the institution, 3 years versus what another time frame might look like, and then fleshing out language around words like corrective and compliance. What does that mean? What does it mean for the EPT? What does it mean in terms of what the support mechanisms that go into place would be when an EPT is not in compliance with the expectations? Yeah. So that's a handful of issues that have already percolated out of this, and I suspect we will bring those and more back to the commission.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's important just for me to note, right? So I'm not opposed to strong accountability for teacher preparation. I think I've mentioned that multiple times in these meetings, and I'm not opposed to a dashboard per se. I think that's actually a good thing for us to have a dashboard. I just want to make sure that the dashboard it captures the right information that's actionable for teacher prep programs, data that we can actually use for continuous improvement. So that's it for me. Thank you.
I know that Dr. Tomerlin wanted to add 2 points regarding EVOS, if it's okay to welcome him back up.
So I apologize not getting this directly to Dr. Seiberg before his presentation, but I did want the commission to be aware that the reference to EVOS, it references performance and growth. So EVOS doesn't measure performance, and and proficiency rather. Mm-hmm. And I would question whether we would want proficiency to be a measure in the placement of student teachers, unless the intent is you get more points for placing teachers in lower proficient schools, which presumably is the...
which runs counter to Dr. Bastian's research that we heard a couple months ago.
So that's something that I think the commission should provide feedback on. The second is I question the active contributing members in the North Carolina State Employment Retirement System as the measure. We have really good records on payroll for any public school. This would effectively eliminate the placement of your teachers in charter schools and not give you credit